Let's begin. Do you remember the Uxbridge and South Ruislip by-election in July 2023? Labour lost narrowly to the Tories and immediately blamed Sadiq Khan's ULEZ scheme. It's all blown over now, but it was an early sign of Starmer's tendency to scapegoat progressive policies when things go wrong. Some predicted that bad local election results would trigger a case of Uxbridgeitis, and so it proved, with Labour sources laying into universities, immigrants and net zero in the name of defeating reform by agreeing with them. The election results undeniably very good for reform and not so good for Labour. But why is Labour's response a lurch to the right? Is it just panic or evidence of a blue Labour agenda? So, Ros, I don't know a single Labour supporter in my life on social media, nor a single sympathetic commentator in the press who supports this approach. Our friend Rob Ford sums it up as Farage is right, don't vote for him. So what is going on? What's your best guess as to why all these predictions about how Labour would interpret bad results turned out to be true?
So I think when you think about how Labour's reacting to this, you have to remember that this is a party that has seen a populist wave coming and does not know how to stop it. And that since its beginnings, Labour has been the party of the working class in its own conception. The man or woman who doesn't have inherited wealth, the union member, the public sector worker, all those people who Labour thought it could rely on for their support. And now all those identities have been eroded in different ways from the 80s onwards. And the party is more and more accused of being elitist. And this has become a kind of ongoing paranoia in Labour, the accusations of elitism. I mean, you saw it in 2010 with the Gordon Brown bigoted woman furore. You saw it with Emily Thornberry and the St George's flags. You saw it in Brexit, where they realised they'd misjudged the public mood massively. And the rationale is that Reform voters' biggest worry is immigration. That's what they always tell pollsters. When you ask Reform voters what they're most angry about, they say immigration. So the logic goes, if we just persuade people that we take immigration seriously, they will stop voting to Reform and they will come back to their natural home in the Labour Party.
But is that true? How many people are we talking about? Because there was polling that showed only a quarter of Reform voters had voted Labour at any time in the last 20 years. So there's only a quarter who have, even potentially in the best of times, sympathetic to Labour.
It's not so important whether it's true or not. And I say that.
Right, Donald Trump.
Yeah, okay. I say that because it's important to how Labour thinks about itself. It's important to how Labour thinks about its history and the people whom it stands for. Now, even though that conception of those people, as I described, and those people are getting smaller and smaller as a percentage of the population, they are still the kind of lodestone of Labour's identity. And that's why it has such powerful cut-through with often highly educated elite at the top of Labour who are constantly feel they need to look behind them in case they're not paying enough attention to what the bloke on the Clapham Omnibus is thinking.
Right, because what this seems to have led them to, this sort of like fetishization of, largely white working class reactionaries, leads them to this contempt for sort of Labour's actual supporters, largely like graduates and progressives and minorities, and almost an unwillingness to accept what the Labour coalition is now rather than what's in their head. So the usual assumption is this is just electoral panic, and I think actually the framing adds to that, because they often go, Labour is doing this right-wing policy to ward off the threat from reform. It's like that's baked into like the reporting. But are you suggesting that this is actually what the sort of McSweeneyite inner circle wants? That that it is a genuine belief. It's not just like, oh God, this makes me feel sick, but we're going to have to do it.
I think it's very hard to say exactly what he's thinking, but I think there's certainly, yes, a degree of sincerity in their desire not to let their own perceived elitism get in the way of whatever it is ordinary people want. It's one of the reasons why, Labour's reflex has often been to make sure that British people are first in line for jobs. That's why one of the reasons why Corbyn was a bit of a Lexiteer, because people coming here from Europe meant that undercut potentially Britain's doing jobs here, and that's one of the reasons why the this week's India trade deal has caused such a furore. Because populists know that the allegation that Labour is making it cheaper to employ foreigners will stick. It will go to the heart of what the party fears is happening, even if the details of the deal tell a very different story, which they do. But it's also another reason. Another thing I think to bear in mind is why Blue Labour is a really unhelpful way and a really unhelpful phrase for Labour to think about this phenomenon, because they're not actually, they don't see it. Internally, they don't see it. They don't want it to be associated with a right-wing Tory point of view. They are reaching back to quite ancestral class preoccupations when they are trying to satisfy what they see, what they sometimes fear, but what they see as ordinary people's concerns.
Matt, Jonathan, and I haven't checked, I've forgotten to check how his surname is spelled, but it's awful, so I don't care. Hinder, I'm going to say Hinder because he is hindering Labour. MP for Pendle and Clitheroe is obsessed with cutting net migration. Now, it's already fallen by a third since the election. 96% of immigration is both legal and has an economic justification. Hinder wants net zero migration, one in, one out, like a busy club. But I mean, if you're just constantly going immigration, regardless of really what the figures are doing, how are you going to beat the anti-immigration party? Like, this is the flaw that I see in the whole thing.
If immigration is reform's greatest strength, then spending loads of time talking about immigration is clearly just playing into their hands. It doesn't mean that you can't talk about it, and it doesn't mean that you shouldn't talk about it, and it doesn't mean you shouldn't have plans to reduce it in a sensible way if that's what you think is the right thing to do. But just saying we need to massively reduce immigration, even though they are reducing immigration, saying, as you say, things like net zero is insane. I mean, there's a phrase that he used, there's a quote from Jonathan Hinder. He shared an op-ed about this and said, if we don't reconnect with our traditional base in the North, the Midlands, Wales, it's over. We must be the party of the patriotic working classes or we are nothing. And that's one of the most dog-whistly things I've heard from a Labour politician in a long time.
Well, he laid into the Liberal establishment as well. It's just like, what if you're in the Labour Party?
I mean, the guy went to Oxford.
Cop, though.
He's still not, I'm sorry, horny-handed son of toil.
But this is the thing. It's like he's basically saying, I mean, nothing he said there could have been, rejected by Farage. It's exactly the kind of thing Farage would say. And it's so dog whistly. It's so sort of saying, as Ros said, well, these are the only people that matter. And as you've pointed out, that's not including a lot of the voting base of Labour now. It's a multi-ethnic. It's in cities a lot of the time, and those are lots of working class people who don't necessarily fit that working class, sort of white working class, patriotic working class thing. And it just feels very. It feels very much just playing on their turf.
Well, I popped onto Hinder's X feed, which I do not recommend, where it's just like the word immigration in sort of different styles, fonts. But I mean, that's not the only message one can take away from reform. Do you think that Labour's perhaps missing the change dimension? That of course, they ran on a change platform. I have a mug from the campaign which says change on it. So that's proof. And Graham Downey, a Labour MP who's critical of this direction, has written a good piece. And he just writes, what he's hearing is, why are you doing this? What is it you're trying to achieve? What type of country is it you're trying to create? We've failed to answer these questions. So there's a whole other reading of this, which is like, people want change. They don't feel they're getting it. And they're going to reform. And that is, if we're talking about actually quite narrow margins, you're not going to peel away half of reform to Labour, right? Talking the narrow margins, if it's all about immigration and not about this sort of broader sense of dissatisfaction, are they missing the real message, I wonder?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good piece by Graham Downey, because he talks about saying that essentially he feels like the Labour Party learned the lessons of Biden for the election campaign, saying that they needed to make sure that they fought the opponents on their own terms rather than on their opponents' terms. You have to talk to voters in their own language and worry about vibes. I'm maybe slightly paraphrasing, but basically that's what he's saying. But saying that then Labour is now in danger of doing the same thing as Biden in office, which is forgetting all of those things and just losing control of the narrative, doing things sort of quietly that are positive without telling people, and then allowing the opposition to sort of make the running. And yeah, it's obviously much harder when you're in charge. And instead of just saying, we will change things, you have to be able to say, we have changed things. And I think that's the thing that they haven't done yet. And it feels like we're in a sort of situation where we've got this sort of long-term plan for change, but the communications is almost like waiting for that to happen rather than showing us the stages along the way, which is, I think, what you need to do to bring people with you and keep banging the drum for the things that you are doing. Because, like, you know, whenever I write something on social media about, I don't feel like Labour are doing things, people always jump up and go, there's all these things. And I just think, yeah, but I haven't really heard about a lot of these things. And you have to go quite in depth into some of the sort of policy documents to find a lot of them. It's not like they're on the front pages, and therefore people, obviously that's a press issue as well. But if you're not constantly repeating what you're doing and making that the absolute focus of your communications, then it's not going to lead to anything.
Ros, one Labour source blamed universities for their funding crisis. He said, and they're also macho about it, a hard rain's going to fall, guys. Watch out. Get your helmets on. And the days of the unaccountable ivory tower are over. Literally nobody who works in universities thinks that there's been an unaccountable ivory tower for like several decades. Now, this is a successful industry full of people who lean left. That is actually really important for growth. Like, why is it? It's one thing to not be helping universities, but quite another that your messaging is like, fuck universities. Do you think that's, because so many of these are unnamed sources, do you think this is just some kind of renegade bullshitter? Or is the government trying to signal fuck universities?
Well, I mean, the government is effectively saying fuck universities, given that they're in complete denial about the scale of the crisis in universities and the sort of drip of job losses, and also what impact it's going to have if they do decide to take away the graduate visa, which they're talking about doing, because the universities basically did exactly what the government told them. And this was successive governments, successive Conservative governments. They expanded, they took in lots more foreign students because that was what Theresa May and Boris Johnson in particular told them to do. And they did that in order to subsidise the teaching of domestic undergraduates. And now the government turns around and says, oh, we don't want so many of those. How come you've put yourself so in hock to these foreign students? You stupid institutions. I mean, the scale of gaslighting is extraordinary. I also suspect they think this anti-university thing is working for Trump, which is an even less forgivable thing to do. But
it's not working. Trump's really unpopular.
I know, but
massively unpopular.
The whole
Except with the kind of people who don't really exist in this country.
Ivory Tower thing is just so insane. I mean, there's more students at Birmingham City University than there are at Oxford now. It is, more or less half of 18-year-olds go to university, but they don't really want to talk about it because then the whole can of worms around tuition fees will come up, and they put up tuition fees a tiny amount last year, but not enough to sort out the financial problems. They know what happened when Nick Clegg agreed to put up tuition fees, and they sure as hell don't want that coming their way again, and they don't know what the hell to do.
Well, there was also some talk from your Labour sources, sort of ditching net zero, which was not like a massive thing. I mean, I know Reform don't like it. Again, a sort of an anti-growth agenda. Richard Tice going, if you want to build sort of green industries, we're going to stop you. We don't want your stinking jobs in our county. And then they go, well, of course, if we're going to do that, then we'll have to get rid of Ed Miliband. I mean, is this, again, like, how seriously should we take this? Is this just
I don't think we should.
I think
actually Keir Starmer is pretty much all in on net zero. And we saw that at PMQs today when he went for Kemi Badenoch over her hypocrisy over it. Ed Miliband is very much on top of his brief. You would be really stupid to put anyone else in charge. Now, the challenge now is that the reform councils are going to make it much harder to build infrastructure. But what Labour is hoping will happen is that they will have to watch other councils, other regions getting jobs and investment that they're missing out on. And they'll be left saying, oh, guys, okay, maybe it's not so bad after all. But, that's a medium-term strategy. But I don't think net zero is actually under threat, no.
Because one of the things that comes out of that book, Get In, was that Starmer quite liked the idea of a broad church, when he became leader. And Morgan McSweeney is like, no, sort of smash the left. And the problem is you start with smashing like the left, and then you move on, these guys move on to the soft left. And so I wonder whether Miliband, like Lisa Nandy, is one of those people that they just sort of want to get rid of. So are we kind of, again, more rather than like the government messaging, are we dealing with basically the kind of the right of the cabinet just briefing against?
We might be dealing with that, but I don't think that Starmer is going to act on it. I mean, I think he's also got Angela Rayner as deputy, who is going to insulate against that kind of thing. Phillipson is, of course, in some trouble at the moment over the school reforms, not to mention the universities and the school reforms that no one is really keen on. And that education isn't really a central mission for Labour. It's not, one of its big targets. And then there's the prospect of potentially another teacher strike coming up if the NUT vote to turn down the latest pay offer. So that's coming down the line. But on all that, I don't see why you'd kick out Phillipson necessarily for those reasons, because she's very far from incompetent.
Matt, we mentioned Graham Downey's piece. There's other MPs like Kate Osborne, former Transport Minister Louise Haigh. I think I've been mispronouncing her name, but as I saw she posted on social media, it's Haigh like the War Crimes Tribunal,
right?
Not hay like horse food. So that's how I'm always going to, every time I look at her, I'm going to think War Crimes.
I'm not sure she's entirely thought that through.
No. I told my wife this and she was like, why not just say, like the place in Holland?
Yeah.
Like that would be safer.
Like the plague. Haig like the plague. Yeah. Oh, no, that's worse.
So they've spoken out against this pandering to reform. Now, I would guess a majority of Labour's 403 MPs are not, in fact, blue Labour / old Labour types and would agree with them. And with things like more welfare cuts in the pipeline, do we need and do you expect much louder dissent from people who this includes a lot of new MPs. I don't think this is why they came into Parliament.
I would hope so. I think we need to see some pushback on this from the more left-leaning people. I mean, I suppose with reform, it feels like we need to kind of be in a situation where, as Ros said, the councils are going to be in a situation where they're going to start fucking stuff up because that's what's going to happen. And then Labour need to ruthlessly expose that that's what's happened and explain why the councils run by Reform are not doing a good job. But Labour can't rely on that. They have to sort of show positive change and show that they're doing things that their voters want them to do. So, yeah, I think we do need more people speaking out. We do need more dissent, maybe is the wrong word, but I feel like I think it goes back to something I think I talked about on a previous podcast about, I think because we've got so many, because the majority was almost too big, there are all these MPs in reform-curious constituencies who are very unlikely to win their seat next time, sort of whatever happens. And yet they are seeming to be almost like the loudest voices at the moment.
I'm always hearing from the Red Wall caucus.
And it feels like that's a situation which is unsustainable because you're leaning then towards the people who probably won't win next time, whatever you do, and you're neglecting the people who probably could win but need help and need not to drain all their resources back over to the Lib Dems and the Greens. So I think, I think I would hope that there's a bit more of a rebalancing of what the parliamentary party thinks about.
So, Ros, it's estimated for every voter Labour lost to Reform, they lost 2 or 3 to Greens, Lib Dems, Independents, and in fact, in a seat like Runcorn, Reform might win, but not because of loads of voters switching to Reform. How many votes is it? Like 8 votes or something. Because the progressive vote splintered and loads of people voted Green rather than voting for Labour or indeed voting tactically for Labour. And a piece that I really recommend on this whole, this whole idea, Ben Ansell's Substack piece, Labour is Learning the Wrong Lessons, which basically pints the whole idea of. And he's run the numbers and says on current polling, big asterisk next to that, Reform could form a minority government, but if you've got loads of tactical voting, you'll produce kind of a lib-lab coalition. So, I mean, if you look at the actual maths, this is where I get confused by the electoral strategy. It's like you will lose more seats to Reform if you neglect the left than actually if you neglect the right. Is there an idea that when the crunch comes, like Macron versus Le Pen, where Macron can just completely piss all over the left, but kind of it's me or the fascist, and they go, all right then. I mean, is that what's happening? And is there a risk that could just backfire, as indeed it did in Runcorn?
Yeah, I think they're hoping that. It's hard to know how sticky the Green vote and the Lib Dem vote are, and whether people are prepared to vote tactically to keep reform out. I suspect a lot of Green and Lib Dem voters would do that, but often that might mean voting Lib Dem rather than Labour. So that creates its own additional problems. I think it's going to take more. It's going to take a visible improvement in the state of Britain for people to turn back towards Labour. And that was never going to happen in 10 months. It would have been nice, but it was never going to happen. And the only other thing I think that would persuade people at this point in the electoral cycle to move towards Labour is feelings of huge insecurity or just strong dislike of Trump and everything he stands for. And this is one reason why I think Starmer's strategy of trying to tack towards Europe and Trump, but a lot towards Trump, saying this is a guy we can work with, has backfired, because then you can't attack reform on the basis of their closeness to Trump. So that's why I think Starmer's got to stop normalising Trump, and I think that will help him to take on reform more effectively.
Well, handily, Matt, we've just seen some counterexamples that centre-left parties in Canada and Australia turned around elections that they were looked set to lose before Trump came along, and they won pretty handily with this very combative anti-Trump message. And as Roz says, reforms ties to Trump should make them vulnerable, but it's not the only thing that makes them vulnerable. I mean, they do talk a lot of shit. Their policy often seems very incoherent, even like you said, on this kind of, we're against these sort of green jobs. Well, that seems like something you could attack them on. There's all these things it seems you could attack them. Not least, and the fact that they're still openly going, we should do a Doge.
Yeah.
We should do what Trump is doing. We're gonna purge the DI department of this council, and then the council goes, we don't. We don't have one. We don't have one. So it seems like there's a lot of openings, and Louise Haig argues that it's just time to pick some fights with the right. They're very good, Labour, at picking fights with the left. They've been doing it since they first decided to sort of distance Starmer from Corbyn. They're like expert. I mean, isn't it time that they just went in hard on reform?
I think so, but they've got to pick fights on the right things, because if they try and pick fights on immigration and things like that, then that's going to just play into reform's hands, because when they try and look hard by saying, we're actually deporting more immigrants than you would, that just doesn't ring true and nobody believes it. And it sounds a bit pathetic to the people they're trying to persuade. And it sounds offensive to the people who are already meant to be on their side. I think the thing about Trump is British people don't like him, but I don't think they're as afraid of him as they are in Canada, for example, obviously. And in Australia, I think it's a slightly different situation where, you had a very Trumpian candidate who then sort of ended up making a lot of mistakes, which then gave them an opening. But Labour did run. Labour in Australia did run against him in that way. But as Rosa said, you can't run against reform saying they're just like Trump, whilst also saying you should be more like Trump, because they're saying there are Labour MPs keep coming out and saying things like, we need to take a leaf out of Trump's book. And Joe White, for example, chair of the Red Wall Caucus, said that Starmer should follow his instincts and issue some executive orders. So as though that's a thing that exists in this country.
Thing. You need legislation and stuff.
And then we should also go for the supermajority. None of it makes it, we should take it to the Congress.
I can't believe sometimes when they go, we should be more like Trump, and someone go, hang on a minute. And they go, no, we don't mean actually any of Trump's policies. Yeah. We just mean getting things done. And it's like, is there not another example of politicians getting things done than Trump? If you want to talk about saving money, which is fine, nobody thinks that you should be leaking unnecessary money. You don't mention Doge. There's a kind of bad politics to it that I just find inexplicable. It's like, we should do what one of the most unpopular leaders in the world should do.
Well, isn't it a sort of lack? It's just a total lack of context and historical understanding. No one seems to know anything that happened more than 10 minutes ago. And so this idea of if you pick a politician who's doing stuff, it has to be Trump. There's no one else. And I think that's part of the problem, is that they feel like they can't refer to anybody else because they're worried that might make them look elitist or something, or it might make them look like they don't understand the common man, which, again, as we've said, is part of what's dragging them down.
Well, obviously as a woke elitist myself, I'm not happy. I'm not happy, Matt.